The elevator smelled like old coffee and someone else's anxiety. Tara Osei had learned to identify that smell, the particular kind of dread that settles into upholstery when people spend too long in waiting rooms or in elevators going up to floors they don't want to reach. She'd spent 3 years as a nursing student at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and somewhere between her second clinical rotation and her first overnight shift in the ICU, she'd stopped noticing the smell of antiseptic. What she noticed now were the subtler things. The way silence had texture, the way people breathed differently when they were afraid. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor of the Barberview Grand, and Tara stepped out with her cello case strapped to her back and a folded sheet of paper in her coat pocket that she hadn't looked at in 6 hours. She wasn't supposed to be here. She knew that. The gig had come through her music professor at the University of Toronto. A private event, well-paying, no questions asked. Dress formal, arrive at 9, leave before midnight. She'd played at enough corporate functions to know the script. Rich people, expensive wine, ambient music they wouldn't actually listen to. She'd smile, play Debussy, pocket the check, and take the 509 streetcar home. Simple, routine. Except the name on the booking sheet had made her professor go very quiet for a long moment before he slid the paper across his desk. "You don't have to take this one," he'd said. She had taken it. The 42nd floor hallway was empty except for 2 men in black suits stationed outside a set of double doors at the far end. They were the kind of men who stood with their weight slightly forward, on their feet, hands loose at their sides. Not decorative security, the real kind. Tara adjusted the strap of her cello case and walked toward them anyway. One of them stepped forward before she'd covered half the distance. "Name, Tara Osei. I'm the musician. I was booked through Meridian Event Group." The second man spoke quietly into a radio clipped near his collar. A pause, then a single nod from the first. Arms out. She was patted down efficiently, not roughly but thoroughly. They checked the cello case. They looked at the sheet music she carried in a black folder. They handed everything back without comment and opened the door. The room beyond was not what she expected. She had expected a ballroom or a boardroom, or at the very least a large suite arranged for a cocktail party. Instead, she stepped into something that looked closer to a private dining room. Dark walls, a long table set for perhaps 20 guests, candlelight. The kind of quiet that comes from excellent soundproofing. Several people were already seated or standing near the windows overlooking the harbor, but they didn't look at her when she entered. What they were looking at was the man at the far end of the table. He was somewhere in his early 40s, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, in a suit that was either very expensive or extraordinarily well-fitted. Likely both. He was speaking to someone beside him in a voice too low to carry across the room, but he stopped when she entered. Not because the door made noise. It hadn't. He stopped because she realized this only later. He had peripheral vision like a hawk, and he catalogued every entry and exit automatically, the way certain people do when they have spent decades in rooms where the wrong entry can end everything. His gaze moved over her once. Then he went back to his conversation. A woman in a grey dress appeared at Tara's elbow with the practiced smoothness of someone paid to be invisible. "The performance space is set up in the corner near the window. You'll play from 9 to 10:30, then take a break. Do not approach the guests unless spoken to." "Understood," Tara said. She set up quietly, rosin on the bow, a quick tune. She did all of it from muscle memory because her eyes were doing something else entirely. Her eyes were reading the room. 3 years of clinical nursing had given Tara a particular skill that she had never quite known how to explain to people. In medical settings, you learn to look at a person the way a mechanic looks at an engine. Not what they're saying, not what they want you to see. What's actually happening underneath. The micro-expressions. The asymmetry in how weight is distributed. The particular stillness of someone who is in pain and hiding it versus the stillness of someone who is waiting to strike. She had learned to read people the way some musicians learned to read a score, not note by note, but as a whole, as a shape, a feeling, an intention. She rosined the bow a second time, which she didn't need to do, because the man at the far end of the table had just shifted his posture in a way that told her, with clinical certainty, that he was carrying an injury on his left side that he'd been concealing for at least several hours. She started playing. The Debussy came out of her the way it always did, effortlessly, from somewhere below conscious thought. She had been playing since she was 6 years old, cello since she was 9, and the instrument had long since become less of a thing she did and more of a thing she was. Music happened while the rest of her mind went elsewhere. What she was thinking about while Claire de Lune unspooled from her bow was the booking sheet, the name, the way her professor had gone quiet, Raffael Drăculea. Not a name most people in Toronto would recognize, but her professor had spent 20 years in Vienna before emigrating, and he had heard the name in certain circles the way people hear about weather, not as something that directly affects them, but as something to respect from a distance. The Drăculea family were old money, old networks, old power, Romanian by origin, pan-European by operation, currently based in. According to the paper, her professor had finally, reluctantly given her Toronto. She hadn't looked it up. She hadn't wanted to. She'd taken the gig because she needed the money, and she had a rule, which was that fear was only useful if it was actionable. If she didn't know exactly what she was afraid of, worrying wouldn't sharpen the picture. Only observation would, so she played, and she watched. By the time she moved into the second piece, Piazzolla, Something with Teeth, she had assembled the following. The man at the head of the table, Raffael Drăculea, was right-handed, left side injury, likely a rib fracture given the specific angle at which he had twice declined to turn his torso. He'd been in the room for at least 2 hours before she arrived. The slight dulling at his eyes, the micro-pauses in his speech. He wasn't drunk. He was tired in the particular way that follows sustained adrenaline, a drop-off that she recognized from triage. Something had happened today, something not planned. He had 8 men in the room, and 2 more she'd clocked outside the door, but only 4 of them were positioned in a way that suggested active vigilance. The others were social, people he trusted enough to let their guard down. That was interesting. A man in his position usually didn't have a category called people I trust. That he did told her something about how he ran things. Twice during her set, someone tried to speak to him in a way that seemed urgent. Twice he deflected with a sentence, maybe 2. Not rudely, just conclusively. The matter was settled before it could become a scene. She'd seen attending physicians do exactly the same thing in trauma bays. The ability to close a conversation without anyone quite realizing they'd been dismissed. She broke at 10:30 as instructed. Setting the bow down and flexing her fingers, she moved toward the side table where water had been left for her, and she was reaching for a glass when someone stepped into her peripheral vision. "You changed the key." She turned. Raffael Drăculea was standing 3 feet away. He was taller than he'd looked from across the room. She'd put him at 6'2", maybe 3. His accent was faint, almost English, with something still underneath it, a cadence that didn't fully belong to any one place. Tara set down the water glass. "I did," she said. "The room is well damped. G minor was going to sit too dark. I moved it up a half step." A pause. Most musicians don't make adjustments like that mid-performance. Most venues don't have this level of acoustic treatment. He looked at her directly. She had the feeling that this was not something he did casually, this direct looking, that most people found it difficult to hold. She returned it without difficulty, because she had learned to hold the gaze of people in crisis, people in pain, people in the particular rawness of fear or grief, and this man was not in any of those states. He was evaluating her. She was quietly doing the same. "You're not just a musician," he said. "I'm a nursing student," she said. "I play to pay tuition." His eyes moved, just briefly and only to her right hand, where the calluses of long cello practice sat at particular points on her fingers, then back to her face. "Nursing, 3rd year. You noticed," he said very quietly, "when you came in." She didn't ask him what she'd noticed. That would have been a performance of confusion she didn't have the energy for, and she had a feeling this man would find it irritating. "Your left side," she said just as quietly. third or fourth rib, I'd guess, based on how you've been distributing your weight. You need to breathe shallower on the left, which means you're not getting full oxygenation. It's been several hours. If it's fractured, that's manageable. If there's underlying lung involvement, you need imaging. The room was close around them. No one else was within easy hearing range. Raffael Drăculea looked at her for a long moment in which she could not read him at all, which was, she would later think, the first time in years that had happened to her. "Fractured," he said finally. "Not the first time. Taped hours ago by a man whose hands shook. Is the tape placed correctly?" "I don't know. I could check," Tara said, and then was briefly startled by her own mouth, because she hadn't decided to say that. She had just said it the way you say drink fluids and come back in 48 hours, reflexively, because someone was hurt and the solution was available. He said, "Why would you do that?" "Because I've been trained to assess injuries," she said. "And you have one, and it seems like it's been managed badly." She picked up her water glass again. "You don't have to say yes." Another long pause. Then, "There's a room behind the panel to the left of the fireplace, 10 minutes. He walked back to the table. She watched him do it. Same gait as before. Compensated, careful, perfectly controlled. He sat down and resumed a conversation that had apparently been waiting for him, and nothing in his posture indicated that anything had changed. Tara finished her water, retightened her bow, and played for another 20 minutes before the woman in grey reappeared to tell her the break had run long. She found the panel. It was exactly as described, to the left of the fireplace, an inset door that looked like wall which opened into a smaller room, a sitting room, wood-panelled, a couch, a side table, a lamp, the kind of room that hotels build for principals who need 5 minutes outside the event. Raffael Drăculea came in 4 minutes after she did and closed the door behind him. "Take off the jacket," Tara said. He did, without comment. Underneath he was wearing a white shirt that was very slightly damp at the left side. Not blood, just the close heat of the tape underneath. He sat on the arm of the couch when she gestured, which put them at approximately the same height, and she moved to his left and started examining the tape placement through the shirt first, then asked, and he nodded. So she untucked the shirt and felt along the rib line with her fingertips. Clinical, professional. She had done this on strangers in emergency departments at 3 in the morning, with chaos happening behind her. She was very good at keeping her hands steady. What she found was that the tape was placed low, useful for the fracture itself, but missing the intercostal pull she could feel when he inhaled. She said, "This is going to need to be redone. The angle is wrong. It's taping the break but not supporting the muscle above it, which is why your breathing is shallower than the fracture alone would explain." "Can you fix it?" "With proper tape, yes. I can give you proper support and you'll breathe better within a few minutes." She tucked the shirt back. "I don't have the materials with me. Tell me what you need," she told him. He picked up his phone and typed something without looking at the screen, and 12 minutes later someone knocked quietly and left a bag outside the door. Medical-grade kinesio tape, sterile gauze, scissors. Not a first-aid kit. The right materials, exactly what she'd listed, sourced in under 15 minutes in a city she didn't know his purchasing reach in. That told her something too. She retaped the ribs in silence, working efficiently, checking the angle twice. When she was done, she had him breathe, deep on both sides, and watched his face, and the relief was visible for a fraction of a second before he controlled it. "Better," he said. "You should still get imaging in the next 24 hours. If there's any increase in pain, difficulty breathing, or you start running a fever, that's a pulmonary complication and you go to a hospital immediately. You're giving me discharge instructions." "I'm giving you common sense," she said. "You can ignore them if you want to." He looked at her for the 3rd time that night in that particular way, the way that felt less like being observed and more like being measured against something, some internal standard she couldn't see. Then he said, "No one in that room knows I'm injured." "I know," she said. "I'm not going to tell them. I'm asking why you noticed." "I notice things," she said simply. "I've trained myself to." In nursing, you have maybe 90 seconds with a patient before the next crisis, and everything you need to know about their status has to fit into those 90 seconds. So you learn to compress. You learn what matters. She folded the leftover tape and set it on the table. You hold your body very well. Anyone who wasn't looking for specific indicators would have missed it. But you looked. I always look. He was quiet. Then he said something that she hadn't expected, which was, "You're not afraid of me." "No," she said. "Most people in this building are. Most people in this building don't know which end of a rib fracture to tape." She picked up her jacket. I should get back to my instrument. She was halfway to the door when he said her name. Not her full name, just Tara, which he must have gotten from the booking documentation or the announcement at the door. She didn't know, and she turned. "The booking was for one night," he said. "I want to extend it, 3 events, over the next 2 weeks. Same rate." He paused. "And if any of those events require a musician who also has a functional understanding of emergency medicine, that knowledge would be useful." Tara looked at him. She was thinking several things at once, which was a habit she'd developed early and never lost. She was thinking about her tuition payment that was due in 6 weeks. She was thinking about her mother in Scarborough, who called every Sunday and never asked about money, but whose voice had a particular quality lately. She was thinking about her clinical placement next semester and the textbooks she hadn't bought yet. She was also thinking about the 2 men outside the door and the careful way this room had been built not to exist. "I'm a musician at these events," she said. "Not anything else." "Of course," he said. "And if anything you ask me to do conflicts with my professional obligations or my ethics, I leave. Also understood." "Then yes," she said. 3 events. She went back to her instrument. She played Piazzolla until midnight, and this time she changed nothing. The key was right, the room was settled, and she let the music do what music does when you stop interfering with it. Nobody in the room looked at her twice. That was fine. She wasn't there for the room. The second event was in a private club on King Street West, members only, the kind of establishment that didn't have a sign outside and didn't need one. Tara arrived at 8, played from 9, and spent the intervening hour in a small anteroom with her cello case open across her knees, listening to the walls. She had a good ear for walls. She'd grown up in a semi-detached in Scarborough, where the neighbors were loud and privacy was theoretical, and she had learned young that walls carry more than people think. Tone, pace, tension. The specific timbre of a conversation that is nearly an argument. What she heard through the wall of the anteroom, before the event began, was not an argument. It was something quieter, and she thought, more dangerous than that. A negotiation conducted in very low voices, in at least 2 languages, only one of which she recognized as English. She shouldn't have been listening. She was aware of that. She listened anyway, because the training that had given her the ability to read a patient's body in 90 seconds had also given her the ability to note a situation clearly and without flinching, to file it accurately, and to decide later what to do with it. What she filed was this. Someone in the next room was afraid of Raffael Drăculea, not performing fear, actually afraid, with a particular careful cadence of someone who was trying to hide it and not quite succeeding, and Raffael Drăculea was not using that fear as a weapon. He was, with notable patience, talking the man down from something, guiding him away from a decision that sounded, from what little she could pass, like it would end badly for someone. That was not what she had expected to hear. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something harder, maybe. Something that confirmed the instinct her professor's careful silence had planted. She played satire that night, quiet and liquid, and watched the room, and Raffael Drăculea caught her eye once from across the space and acknowledged it with nothing more than a slight tilt of his head, and she returned to her music. Afterwards, she was packing up when he appeared at her elbow again. "How are the ribs?" "That's my question," she said. "You're moving better?" The tape held. A pause. "You were listening earlier. It wasn't an accusation. It was stated as a fact with something underneath it, not anger," she thought. "Something more curious than that." "I was waiting in the anteroom," she said. "The walls are thin. They are." he agreed. What did you hear? She considered lying. She had the ability for it in a technical sense. She could construct a plausible surface, keep her face level, deliver it cleanly. But she'd built her clinical practice on accurate reporting, and misrepresenting a finding, even a small one, felt like the kind of erosion she didn't want to start. Enough to know that whoever was in that room was frightened, she said, and that you were talking him out of something rather than into it. Raffael Drăculea said nothing for a moment. Then what do you make of that? I don't make anything of it, Tara said. It's not my business. You could, he said. Make it your business. There are things I sometimes need to know about the people I work with, whether they're well, whether there are signs of pressure, stress of a particular kind. She understood him. She looked at him and understood him very precisely, and she made herself wait for a full breath before answering. You want me to read the room? Medically, psychologically. You already do, he said. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to do it deliberately and report to you. Yes, that's... She stopped, restarted. What you're describing crosses a line that I'm not sure I'm comfortable crossing. I'm not asking you to harm anyone, he said. I'm asking you to tell me if someone at my table is about to collapse under a weight I didn't know they were carrying, whether someone is in a state that indicates they might make a decision under duress that they shouldn't. She thought about that. That's not a weapon, she said slowly. That's welfare. Yes, he said again, and that simple, unelaborated confirmation told her more about him than anything she'd observed in 2 evenings across a room. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it on the 509 streetcar home, in the particular hollow exhaustion that comes after a performance, when the body stops holding itself in the shape required and simply softens. She thought about her ethics class from last semester, the unit on observational reporting and duty of care. She thought about the fact that what he was asking was, technically, something she did already. She read people, she assessed them, she flagged when something was wrong. The question was only whether she did it in service of someone whose motives she wasn't certain of. She thought about his voice when he'd said welfare, level and unperformed, the word landing in the room without decoration. She called her friend Patrice when she got home, which she did when she needed to think out loud to someone who wouldn't repeat it. She said, hypothetically, if someone asked you to use your clinical skills in a context that was slightly outside normal parameters. How slightly? Patrice said. The person asking operates in a complicated industry. A pause. Tara, hypothetically, I'd want to know whether what you're using those skills for is hurting anyone. No, she said, possibly the opposite. Patrice was quiet for a moment. Then hypothetically, I think you already know what you're going to do. The third event was different. She knew it was different as soon as she arrived, because the security was heavier, more men, differently positioned, the particular alertness she'd learned to associate with elevated threat levels rather than routine caution. She counted 12 before she'd reached the elevator bank. She counted 3 more on the ride up, none of whom she'd seen at any previous event. The room was a penthouse suite, 20 guests perhaps, but the tenor of the room was nothing like the careful professional neutrality of the previous 2. This had the particular charged quality of a room where something was about to happen. She sat up near the window and started playing before anyone asked her to. Music, she had found, was one of the most reliable tools for resetting the temperature of a room, not by demanding attention, quite the opposite. By becoming part of the air, a frequency that the body registered before the mind decided whether to respond to it. She played something long and unspooling. Bach, the cello suites, slow enough to breathe with, and felt the room begin to organize itself around the sound. Raffael Drăculea entered at 9:47. She knew because every other person in the room knew. She'd learned to track him by the realignment of attention in the space. A collective shift, like a field of grass adjusting to a change in wind. Tonight, he was accompanied by a man she hadn't seen before. Older, grey-haired, with the quality of someone who had spent decades learning to make himself easy to underestimate. He moved differently from the security staff, not positioned to protect but to observe, which in her experience meant either advisor or threat. She played and she watched. At 10:15, a man on the far side of the room did something that made the back of her neck go cold. He shifted his weight, so small a movement that she doubted anyone else clocked it, and his right hand dropped to his jacket pocket and stayed there, not to retrieve something, to check that something was there. She knew that gesture. She had seen it twice in clinical settings, once in a hospital corridor that turned out badly, and she had been trained to recognize it as a category of movement associated with escalating agitation. She played through the next 4 bars without changing anything in her face or her bow arm. Then she redirected her gaze, casually the way someone's eyes drift when they are absorbed in music, toward Raffael Drăculea at the far side of the room. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she did something she had not planned. She moved her eyes deliberately to the man across the room. Back to Raffael Drăculea, back to the man. That was all. Then she looked back at her music stand. Raffael Drăculea said something to the man beside him. Very quiet, nothing visible on his face. The older grey-haired man straightened almost imperceptibly and began a slow drift toward the far side of the room. She kept playing. Over the next 9 minutes, through the remainder of the Bach suite and into the opening of a Shostakovich piece she had not originally planned to play. The man with his hand in his jacket pocket was smoothly, almost choreographically, separated from the main cluster of guests. The grey-haired man guided him with a hand at the elbow, not restraining, just redirecting, and they moved through a side door, and the door closed and the room exhaled. She finished the Shostakovich. She played 2 more pieces. At midnight, she packed her cello and fastened the case, and stood for a moment looking out at the harbor, which was dark and cold and beautiful in the way that Toronto is beautiful in November, which is the kind of beauty that asks nothing of you. You saw him first. She turned. Raffael Drăculea was standing behind her, close enough that she could see the tension he was still carrying at the corners of his eyes, the specific exhaustion of someone who has managed a crisis without letting it show. Yes, she said. How? His right hand, the pocket, the weight check. She paused. I've seen that before, in emergency contexts. What it means. Someone who is deciding, she said, whether or not to do something they are frightened of doing. He looked at her. The room was mostly empty now, the guests filtering toward the exit with the careful casualness of people who have learned to leave without being remembered. You didn't panic, he said. I had an instrument in my hands, she said. Panicking would have been difficult to explain. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. It was gone before she could name it. He's been dealt with, he said. He won't be a problem. Is he all right? A pause. He seemed genuinely surprised by the question. He's fine, he said slowly. He was. Paid to make a scene. He chose not to. Good, Tara said. She put on her coat. She was reaching for the cello strap when he said her name again. I'd like to make this a permanent arrangement, he said. Not just events, ongoing. A retainer. She looked at him. You know what I'd say to that. I know what your first answer will be, he said. I'm asking you to give it more than 30 seconds. She gave it more than 30 seconds. She stood there in the cooling penthouse, with her cello case on her back and the harbor behind her, and thought about it with the same clarity she brought to assessments, the same refusal to let sentiment or fear do the deciding. What she had done tonight had not hurt anyone. What she had done was notice something that would have hurt several people if it had unfolded, and she had communicated it in the only language that fit the moment, which was music and eye contact, and 2 seconds of deliberate looking. She had used her skills. She had used them well. The room was safe because she was in it. What would a retainer look like? She said. Not agreement, an inquiry, and the look on Raffael Drăculea's face when she said that, the particular way his shoulders settled. The first time in 3 evenings she had seen him allow himself something close to relief, told her something that she saved very carefully. Not to use. Not yet. Just to know. That this man who was feared in rooms she was only beginning to understand had been waiting for someone who would stay in the room. She thought she might be that person. She thought it carefully, with all the precision her training had given her, and she didn't let herself say it out loud. She said, instead, "Tell me what you need." And the harbour spread dark and vast below them, and the city held its noise outside the glass. And she waited, not like someone waiting to be protected, but like someone who had already decided what she was capable of and was now making sure the other person understood it too.